Hello and welcome to Don't Be a Heretic. This week we're going to talk about the next section of the Apostles' Creed. It reads, He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. It's important to note that Jesus died. If you didn't know that, chances are you're not a Christian. When we think about Jesus' death, it's important to note that his death is propitiation. That means that it was a legal payment for the penalty of our sin to put us in right relationship with God. That means a lot of stuff even further. That means that Jesus was righteous and didn't deserve to pay the penalty of sin. And we're unrighteous and we do deserve to pay the penalty for sin. The penalty for sin is death, and we deserve to pay that. But Jesus didn't, because he wasn't sinful at all. You see, when Jesus died on the cross, he was paying for our sin. He didn't deserve to pay that, but we did, and he paid it on our behalf. That's really good news for you and for me. You see, when we think about Jesus' death, we can know that Jesus was sinless. We talked about that previously. And he was a man, so he was the right kind of substitute. Yeah, people killed a whole lot of bulls and goats, sheep, pigeons and doves, and probably some other stuff too, trying to pay for their sins all the way through the Old Testament. They were never enough. They were never good enough. It's also important to know that when Jesus died, he suffered extreme levels of anguish, a unique type of suffering that no one else has ever suffered, at least not in the exact way he did. One, Jesus was crucified, which is a terribly painful way to die. Some say that it's the most painful way that someone has ever been executed, and that's probably not entirely accurate, although it was no doubt unbelievably painful. The scriptures don't say that Jesus needs to have suffered more than anyone else in order to fully pay the price for sin. It never claims that anywhere. But it does say that the payment has to be made. And Jesus made that payment by dying in our place. When he died in our place, he felt the suffering of the physical pain on the cross. He also felt the emotional, psychological anguish of bearing the guilt of sin. You or me, whenever we sin, we feel terrible about it. Especially as we grow in holiness and look more like Jesus. And we start to hate sin more, then our sin is even more grotesque than it used to be. But Jesus, he was completely sinless. He never once sinned. He hated sin. And yet he bore the weight of all the guilt of humanity's sins. Not just one or two people's, billions and billions of people's sins. So throughout their whole lives, Jesus bore those. He hated sin way more than you or I. You know, Jesus also suffered the anguish of abandonment. His disciples betrayed him and ran away and denied him. And so when he was there suffering the weight of the sin and suffering the physical anguish on the cross, he was doing it alone. And not even just alone in the sense that his friends had abandoned him. Also, his relationship with God the Father was interrupted. Yeah, the presence of God the Father had been his greatest joy throughout his earthly life, and it was interrupted whenever he bore the weight and the guilt of sin, of the sins of humanity. That's why he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" For the first time in his earthly life, he felt the abandonment of the Father. Did you know that the Apostles' Creed teaches things that aren't true? It says that Jesus descended into hell, and that's just not a very true statement. Nope. In fact, the scriptures nowhere teach that Jesus descended into hell and was punished in hell. Nope. the contrary, it does teach that he would have gone to be with the Father in heaven following his death. Yep, he says to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. Not today you'll be with me in hell. He also says to the Father as he prays, into your hand I commit my spirit, just before he passes, indicating that he expected that whenever he died, he was going to be in the presence of the Father. And lastly, on the cross, he cried out, it is finished, indicating that he had paid for the full penalty of sin. He had suffered all of God's wrath and fully taken the weight of guilt and shame and punishment upon himself. So why does the Apostles' Creed say that Jesus descended into hell when he didn't? Well, because words are messy. Like sometimes when somebody says, I have a specific example for you. But what they really mean is specific. Yeah, they say that because they don't know how to pronounce the word rightly. Or because they think that Pacific is not an ocean. And they think that it means one individual isolated example. But it doesn't. It also might be just kind of the way that words change over time. That's probably a more fair and more accurate explanation. Just like the word bad means bad usually, but sometimes it means good, which is confusing. That's what it means. In the same way, some of the words that were used to describe Jesus' death, the place that he went following his death, would be confusing. See, there was a word that was used that could mean death, or could be translated hell. The writer inserted that into the Apostles' Creed. He intended for it to mean that he had gone into the grave, that his body and soul had separated. He was in the place of death. Some people began to translate it hell. For whatever reason, it just stuck. So whenever we think about it, we should think about the phrase saying not that he descended into hell, but instead that he descended into death, indicating that he fully died in the way that humans die. His body stopped functioning, and the spirit and his body were separated. He went to the place of the dead. And then he was buried. And they rolled a big stone on top of the grave. Thanks for joining me for Don't Be a Heretic.